And so our speaker today is English teacher and 10th grade class dean, Stephanie Passero. She holds a Master of Arts in English Literature from Northumbria University in Newcastle, England, and a Bachelor of Arts in English from Georgia State University. She began her teaching career as an adjunct professor at Quincy College in Boston before moving to Virginia, where she taught in the Diocese of Arlington for 8 years before being inspired by an Okie, an Oak-Crest student, to apply to Oak-Crest, where she has now been teaching for 4 years. She is always eager to talk about books for great lengths of time, both in and out of the classroom. I'd like to introduce Stephanie. Hello. Can you all hear me? Thank you all for coming today in our unpredictable weather and unusual schedule to hear what I have to say about a subject that's quite dear to me. If you want to have a seat, there's plenty of seats available here. Oh, you're on my team. Okay. So this subject is quite dear to me, and I wrote it all down because it's so important to me. I wanted to make sure I avoided tangents and anecdotes, which is my tendency. Not that I don't have anecdotes planned, but they're planned. Some time ago, I asked, 2 months ago maybe, I asked Terry Collins to mention to our Oak-Crest parents about the importance of talking to our daughters about the books they read for pleasure. I must have been too passionate when I talked about it because she asked me to give this talk to you. During back-to-school nights, my elevator pitch on good books that I usually give paraphrases Flannery O'Connor, claiming that an English teacher's job is to teach her students good taste. I'm not going to accuse our girls of having bad taste. I'm just going to talk to you today about good books. So great, but mostly good. I often read books about books, and I want to share my favorite pieces of advice I've gathered over the years that have helped me as a teacher, as a reader, and as a spiritual mother to my godson, niece, and nephews. It's difficult to keep up with the avalanche of modern teen and preteen literature. It's impractical for us to try to read everything our daughters want to read before they can get to it. So one approach is to intervene early, inundate her with good stories while she's in grammar stage. Vigen Gorian, professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia, loves fairy tales and wrote a book called Tending the Heart of Virtue on the importance of fairy tales for children. He says when his children stopped letting him read fairy tales aloud to them, he decided to teach fairy tales to his college students. He found these stories have a great impact on his students, even though he had children in mind when he wrote Tending the Heart of Virtue. In it, he has a great summary of the moral imagination. He says, the moral imagination is the very process, so it's a process, not a feature, by which the self makes the metaphors out of images collected by experience, and then employs these metaphors to find moral correspondences in experience. Jonathan Jones, the online magazine, First Things, also adds that moral imagination is the proper ordering of the soul. Humans are connected with the sacramental order of creation and can draw true analogies and lived experiences, which can be interpreted through our imagination. This means our moral imagination is active, needs proper exercise, so it will not, as Gorian says, atrophy like a muscle that's not used. The richness or poverty of the moral imagination depends on the richness or poverty of experience. Parents, as the primary teachers of their children, provide these early experiences for them, as do the stories they introduce to their children. Stories, particularly fairy tales, allow the reader to, as Gorian says in Tending the Heart of Virtue, imagine herself in the place of heroes and heroines of other worlds, experiencing the risks taken without having to endure all the consequences of failure, but still receiving the lessons. A child having read these stories will have a sharpened moral imagination. These stories offer powerful images of good and evil and show our children how to love through experiences and images they can interpret in the real world. So these stories fill our children up with experiences that they can draw from when they create. So as you know, it's vital to fill our children up with good stories that will ignite their imagination. Which Gorian says, when the moral imagination is awakened, the virtues come to life. I delight in fairy tales. They're not just for children, for the immature. In his essay on 3 Ways of Writing for Children, C.S. Lewis addresses the accusation that fairy tales are some form of escapism. He says the escapism to be wary of is in realism that is so close to school life, the child returns to the real world discontented. Lewis calls those types of stories flattering to the ego. The pleasure consists in picturing oneself in the object of admiration, while the fairy tale arouses the reader's longing for he knows not what. Now, I'm quoting Lewis here, and I'm going to change all the he's to she's because this is interesting. He says, it stirs her with a sense of something beyond her reach and gives new dimension of depth. She does not despise the real woods because she has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. The child reading the type of book Lewis calls escapism desires success and is unhappy once the book is finished because she cannot have it. The child reading the fairy tale is happy for the very fact of desire. Fairy tales have the power to awaken our minds to the beauty of the world, while the more trivial novel falsely makes us unhappy with the real world. Now, those who may have read Ranger King's Blue Fairy Book or any number of colors from that series, Blue Fairy Book, the Red Fairy Book, Orange Fairy Book, may object to the violence of the original fairy tales. I must admit that when I was reading the story of Prince Hyacinth to my niece aloud, I edited a scene where the princess cuts off a bit of her finger to complete a ladder in order to go save Prince Hyacinth. I didn't have the courage to read that whole scene to her. However, there is nothing to fear about inadvertently introducing some version of the boogeyman to your daughters. G.K. Chesterton wrote an essay called The Red Angel. All of these works that I'm referencing, by the way, I have on the list in the back there. In The Red Angel, G.K. Chesterton says that, or he asserts, that we do not give children the boogeyman through fairy tales. He calls it the bogey, but I'm not English, so I'm going to say the boogeyman. Fairy tales do not give children the boogeyman. What fairy tales give the child is her first clear idea of the possible defeat of the boogeyman. Chesterton says that the baby has known the dragon intimately ever since she had an imagination. What fairy tales provide for her is a St. George to kill the dragon. So far, I've shared some things that I've read that are good reminders for us with small or intermediate age children, but I must admit I had our teenage daughters in mind as I prepared to speak to you today. When our children are younger, they're more open to our opinions. If mom and dad say a book is good, they're willing to read it with a joyful heart. Better still, they curl up with mom and dad and read good books with the family, bolsters a fondness for beauty, which they cannot help but keep throughout their lives. It is when our girls reach the teen years that they tend to close the door on our suggestions. They want the privacy to discover good books on their own. It is this privacy that we need to be wary of. It's not practical to attempt to read every book your daughter intends to devour. Some books have so many volumes in a series it's nearly impossible to keep up. But it is important to have conversations with your daughters about the books she chooses to read for pleasure. Ask what captivates her, thrills her, moves her, takes hold of her. What is it about the books she chooses to read that enrich her through its quality, enchants her through its depth, vitality, truthfulness? What convinces her through inherent logic and elevates her through the beauty of its poetic content? Now, most of these questions I've adapted from Dietrich von Hildebrandt's book, Aesthetics. There are 2 volumes of this work. The first talks about beauty on all levels, including objectivity, the objectivity of beauty, its value, its form, its role in the senses. The second volume applies von Hildebrandt's philosophy of beauty to the arts. I recommend this book to anyone who, like me, cannot define beauty, but they know it when they see it. It is important not to be ironic when asking your daughter about a book she is reading, especially if you have concerns about it. She may see through our veiled derision if we narrow our eyes at the paranormal romance number 3 of the series and chidingly sneer, what elevator say like that? You do not want to push her. Honestly find out what is she attracted to in that book. You do not want your daughter to feel as if she has to hide her tastes from you or feel ashamed of them. We want to inspire our daughters. In Landscape of Dragons, another book advocating fairy tales, Michael O'Brien has valid concerns about inverted morals, the offensive and the downright profane and irrelevant ugliness of many modern books and films targeting our youth. And he wrote this book in 1998. Yes, it is frightening and overwhelming to consider the avenues in which your daughter is approached with influences, and it is tempting to give up trying to stay on top of what she is reading and watching. Michael O'Brien warns us not to dismiss the battle for your daughter's soul. The things she reads does form her. They do form her. Similarly, it is unrealistic and ineffective to make everything released after 1960 off limits. O'Brien says you must remember that we are in a spiritual war zone. God permits this struggle, the struggle of temptations, in order to strengthen us, to teach us to rely more completely on Him and less on our own limited strengths, to instruct us who draws ultimately to Himself. In an article by Jessica Houghton-Wilson called Reading to See the Fullness of Things, she summarizes an idea about 2 forms of self-knowledge concerning the idol versus the icon. And she's talking about literature, and she's talking about the idol versus the icon. The icon being the sacramental order we are all connected to. So the kind of book that's like an idol. The idol looks into a mirror and never sees past itself. The only view she sees is self. The icon gazes at the person and reveals to her who she is in God's eyes rather than through her own. It both teaches the gaze how to see and shows the gazer how to venerate the unseen viewer. She's talking probably about Dante and Flannery O'Connor, where the reading is very purgatorial. When you read Dante or Flannery O'Connor or books like that, the repulsive characters in those works seem so far away from us, but in the end, we realize that we share many of those faults with those characters. Reading the work becomes the examination of conscience, a moment of grace that allows us as readers to reevaluate our own shortcomings. Now, in that article, Houghton-Wilson is speaking of the great books. This does not mean we only have to read books from the literary canon. It is fine just to read a good book. You don't have to read all the great ones. Here are some practical suggestions on bringing good books into your daughter's life, in addition to sending her to Oprah, where all the books are good. Read with her. You may already read bedtime stories as a family, or maybe you try to read together so many days a week. Reading aloud together is a beautiful way to bond and teach. When I introduce Anne of Green Gables to 6th graders, they often lack the stamina to start the book on their own. The language is gorgeous and brimming with nature imagery that sounds like a romantic poem instead of prose. Now you and I as adults notice it beautiful, but a child grows weary during the most beautiful passages about grass and a lake. I always begin that book by reading it aloud with the girls. By the time we're introduced to our heroine, they're captivated. Megan Cox Gurdon speaks of the importance of reading aloud in her book, The Enchanted Hour. She mentions an opportunity she had during her research to see a surviving volume of fairy tales, Charles Perrault from 1695. This book was a gift for the teenage niece of Louis XIV. Megan Cox Gurdon noticed that in the margins for the tale Little Red Riding Hood were written directions near the dialogue of the wolf when he says, "The better to eat you with." The tiny handwriting says, this is translated from the French, "These words should be said in a loud voice to make the child afraid that the wolf will eat him." These stories were intended to be read aloud. There's a nonfiction book called The Reading Promise by Alice Ozma. Alice is the daughter of a single father, a school librarian, with whom she formed a pact, I believe, of her own initiative when she was 9 years old, to read aloud with her father every day for at least 10 minutes for a year. She and her father called it the streak. Not only did they succeed in reading aloud together every day for a year, but they kept the streak going until Alice was 18 years old. There were times when they would have to wake up extra early to fit in their reading time, or in later years when Alice was out with her friends who would call her father and have him read to her over the phone. If they were angry at each other, they would still read. In the closing pages of her book, Alice describes in a sort of epilogue what her father is doing now in his retirement, sitting on the porch with a book, bird watching. She refers to her father as a superhero. Many readers are attracted to book and reading challenges. I recommend you discourage your daughter from reading challenges that promote mere quantity as an accomplishment. One really good book that may take ages to read is worth more than a stack of novels that feel empty, but are quick reads. And challenge her instead to read for pleasure every day. I myself have taken on this challenge just a month ago, because poetically, English teachers rarely have time to read for pleasure, at least during the school year. We yearn for our favorites, or a growing list of to-read books. While preparing for this talk, I realized that I need to read for pleasure as well, and not just during vacation. So inspired by the reading promise, I made a promise with myself to read something for pleasure. Not a school book, even though those are a delight to me. So I'm going to read for pleasure for at least 10 minutes a day. So I started a reading journal in which I mark days in the month that I read for pleasure to get the streak going, or I haven't missed it in 10 days. I color-coded it. Most of the entries are in pink, which is the 10 to 20 minute range. And even though all I seem to have time for is 10 minutes a day of reading for pleasure, I already feel so much more refreshed than I usually do. So another suggestion for the teen who feels too awkward to read aloud with their parents: there's a fine bond you can form with your daughter in a book club for two. Perhaps you and your daughter can choose a mother-daughter read, or a father-daughter read, or family read, and discuss the book over dinner. You can even take her out to lunch or a picnic in the park. You can make it special and important that you have this shared experience of the book. Talk about it. It's not necessary to only discuss the book when you finish it. Perhaps it will take 4 months to read a book. This means you can meet with your daughter 4 times at a picnic or a cafe or the living room and discuss this book together. Another way to share books with your children is audiobooks. I once had a student who knew just about every Charles Dickens novel and would talk about the books with me. Now, this student was in 7th grade at the time. She didn't have a full understanding about Dickens' work, but I was impressed and puzzled how a 7th grader could know so many books by this author who takes most students some time and stamina to appreciate. I assumed she watched film adaptations. She later told me that her family drives to Canada every summer to visit relatives, and for as long as she could remember, her parents would play an audiobook in the car, Charles Dickens' novel, filling her imagination with beautiful prose, and she carries that experience with her to this day as an adult. I believe she can be a teacher. I want to share one last anecdote before I get into some suggestions for books. This one is in support of writing directly into the books we read. Lee Lowe, I'm going to keep saying her name Lee Lowe because there's a Lee Lowe and a Cheryl Lowe. I'm not talking about Lee Lowe in Stitch. Lee Lowe is the daughter-in-law of Cheryl Lowe, the founder of Memoria Press and Highlands Latin School. Lowe has known her mother-in-law since she was 18 and treasures her mother-in-law's book suggestions, which she discusses in her article, Why to Mark a Book, which I found in the Classical Teacher magazine Ginny Bowles gave to me a couple of years ago. Cheryl Lowe has already passed away, but Lee Lowe is gifted many of Cheryl's books through her father-in-law. Lee noticed markings in all of her mother-in-law's books, which gave her more insight to Cheryl's reactions to these books. Marking books will visually demonstrate contemplation. It will help you quickly find the quotes that are meaningful to you, your favorite quotes. It also personalizes the experience, which is Lowe's point. She says that it made it possible for her children to have a conversation with their grandmother because she took up a pen and she read. In Cheryl Lowe's copy of Charlotte's Web, and now I'm assuming we all know the events of the final chapter of Charlotte's Web. Lee Lowe's mother-in-law wrote in the final chapter, "Life is full of hard things, but we can strive to help each other and raise ourselves to nobility. Charlotte knew all along she wouldn't survive the fall season, but she helped Wilbur enjoy what she could not." Lee Lowe says that we mark our books. When we mark our books, we, unlike Charlotte, can live beyond our season. We can continue to speak to those we love indefinitely. We all want good books for ourselves and for our daughters, and so I brought along many suggestions. There are lists I have copied for you that are available on this talk on that back table, which are compiled by some of my favorite books about books. So, Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren's How to Read a Book is more fun for an adult to read. I don't really recommend it for our girls. And even for adults, it's really not that fun to read. But it's one of my favorite books. And Mortimer Adler is an expert on philosophy. I'm not an expert on philosophy. He convinced me that you have to read philosophy or know philosophy to be able to read well. And I can't just pick up philosophy and read it either, so he has many other ways to explain that. Anyway, I love that book. He has a list in the back of suggestions to read. These are all the great books. So again, not really for our girls right now, but still a great book to have in your library. Landscape with Dragons by Michael O'Brien. I can tell you the anecdote of how I came to this book. Okay. I'll just tell you this book. Michael O'Brien teaches the necessity, like he kind of reiterates what Lewis and Chester were talking about, the necessity of a definitive good and evil in children's lives. So they're not too relativistic when it comes to villains, right? Not, well, I feel bad for the villain. It's because he was wrong that he does it. It's still wrong. Sorry. Anyway, so good and evil. And I have to warn you, though, that all of our favorites in here takes to task. There are some of my favorite books and movies in here, and he just brings me to task. But it also, out of all my suggestions, have the most extensive suggestions of books. So it was compiled by the staff of Bethlehem Books, and it is pages and pages of books suggestions, particularly great for 9 to 10-year-olds. So if you have children in that age range, this would be a good one for you to pick up. Animated copies of those lists of books. I mentioned already The Enchanted Hour by Megan Cox Gurdon. She explains the benefits in this book of reading to children aloud, and her suggestions of books are thoughtfully compiled with the intention for reading aloud with your children. The next book and second to last list is How to Read Your Way to Heaven. This I use just for the list because it's great spiritual reading. If you've not seen this book, it's really a 4-year plan on reading the Catechism, the Bible, and many spiritual classics that we just haven't gotten around to reading that Christians should read. I didn't purchase this book with the intent of using the 4-year plan, but if I had used the 4-year plan, I would have read all those things by now, but it's okay. I've been using the list one at a time. Anyway, the list in the back is gathered from contributors like Dan Burke, Father John Crosby, Father Mike Schmicks, Father Tim Gallagher, Peter Kraft. So lots of great authors and sources, contributors to that. I made copies of my own personal edition for you, so you'll see my markings in there, and I've exposed which books I've read or wanted to read or gave up on. Finally, the last list is likely to be the one you and your daughter will be most interested in. I gathered some favorite reads from Oakcrest faculty and staff. I asked our faculty and staff to provide titles of books they read again and again for pleasure. I compiled this list and attached it to a copy of Oakcrest enrichment list as well. And the enrichment list is available online, but there's just something about having a list in your hands that you can check off and mark up and just fulfills us. Now this is something also, in this list, there's something that can inspire girls to keep wanting more. One final and practical thought when choosing to read, what to read next with your daughter, do not make the mistake I know I tend to make when I go to the library and check out a large stack of books. One is enough. When one is finished, then really more. I'm not sure why, but when I have a large stack of books, I tend to read a little of each one and not finish any of them. Sort of like my stomach is full, but my eyes are still hungry. One is enough for now. Thank you. So we do have time for questions. If anybody has questions they'd like to ask, if they're not hard questions. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us two of your favorite books when you were in high school? When you were in high school.
When I was in high school, that's a different story. I had terrible taste in high school.
Oh, okay.
I liked the bell jar, and I wouldn't touch the bell jar now. It's just, yeah, I liked that, but I also remember in high school, I would read, I was just so lost. I didn't have book suggestions or anything like that. We didn't have Goodreads. I didn't know if you click on something, you can get what's next. I just, yeah, Oprah's Book Club, I would read those books, and then I would, books that had great covers, and then, but I always just was always reading something. And so, I remember the first time I really changed my taste, because I was just always reading something, was when I read Jane Eyre. And then after that, other books just didn't seem as good. They didn't compare. And so I was attracted more to the better books, and I left all my teen novels behind. Yes, ma'am.
What about graphic novels? They've kind of taken over a little bit, and I've seen some that like Saint graphic novels, and they now have like a graphic novel Bible.
A graphic novel?
Yeah, so, and I've seen different opinions. Some people are like, oh, well, it encourages kids to start reading when they're younger, but some just...
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that is good for fluidity, I mean, sure, but then won't they only want those books, and then when they don't have pictures? Reading aloud, I think, is best to get through that stamina. And like people say, there's always a balanced diet, but it tends to be, we mostly have the ones we want, and we have one good one. It should be the other way around. But I'm not an expert in graphic novels. I will warn you, though, that books like manga and things like that can have some pretty alarming content. So make sure you check the back of those books, because they're rated. Just because it's cartoony doesn't mean that it's clean. They're rated on the back of the books.
We have an issue with the girls just rereading and rereading.
That's good if they reread.
But they reread books that I would, like the graphic novels, or the ones that are like below their reading level, that go kind of back to those. And
I read Narnia over and over again.
I would love if they read Narnia over and over again. We're talking about, like simple, easy reads, that I think they find comfort in because they don't provide the challenge. How do we kind of encourage them, or is that okay just to let them do that on their own?
I mean, always keep an eye on what they're reading and why are they rereading it. What is it that they like about it? Because if it's a Harlequin romance and they're 15, you might want to find out why they're rereading that book. But if it's just a book that you're not satisfied, if it's just empty and you want them to have more, yeah, find out what they like about that book, and then find a book that you know is better that might suit their tastes and read it together. Or I like that audiobook idea from that student, because they're trapped in the car and they don't know where to go. But that would be my suggestion, that just start them with something else that you know is similar to their taste. Find out why they like those books, what's similar to their taste, and then find something better, or something that will open them up a little more with imagination.
I have maybe a similar question. Maybe it's the same question. So, my daughter had we read together every night since she was a baby, and I loved that she had this high tolerance for stuff that was way above, that she obviously couldn't read it herself, but, mysteries and, mythology and beautiful stories. And then she got to a point, somebody introduced her to Percy Jackson, which is, so I thought, oh, well, it's mythology. But then I looked at it and I realized that the language was kind of snarky. And I remember asking a woman at a bookstore in the town where we lived, I said, I'm really worried because it's like she's slipped and now she only wants to read this stuff that has this certain tone and it doesn't have the same kind of beauty that some of the other books we had read up to that point had. And those are the books that she rereads and rereads. Mm-hmm. And then somebody introduced her to Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Mm-hmm. This is a kid who read all the Harry Potter books in second grade and loved them. And then my fear was, if it's not fantastic and it's not mythological, she'll never be able to sit through it. And then I thought, but she's sitting through this Diary of a Wimpy Kid just seems like such a, not an edifying story. So I'm battling, I'm not sure what question I think. How do you get through
Get her
that
back on
challenge
track.
of rereading okay, but to continue to try to have the stamina to read those books that might be a little more challenging on your own, like not just for class, but on your own and enjoy them, even though they're not fast-paced and they're not furious and they don't have fabulous, fantastical, mythical characters.
Right, so a good book, I think that's perfect candidate for the mother-daughter book club, right? Where it's something special, especially if you have multiple kids. She's the only one that gets to go. And when you have a deadline too, I know I run 2 book clubs, and if I didn't have those deadlines, I wouldn't have read half these books that I read, because there's just no time. But you make time all of a sudden. So when there's a deadline, you make time, and you can make it joyful, not just, here's this thing that you're going to do, and we're going to get you back on track. Because I can see how disheartening that would be. And you want her to have the same joy in something beautiful, but it takes a long time to get there too, right? You can, it's just not the fondness though for those beautiful things that you read when you were young. That's the whole point of the grammar stage, or having us memorize poems in the grammar stage, or the fondness for those works in the grammar stage. In 6th grade, the first 3 minutes of my class, every single day for middle schoolers, I say, who wrote Don Quixote? Who wrote Anna Karenina? Who wrote Leo Tolstoy? Who wrote, Les Miserables? They don't know anything about these books, but they start memorizing the authors. And then all of a sudden they get excited when they see it. So when they get to high school, they're like, oh, this got a letter, I heard of that. And that's enough to get them into it, as long as they have someone that can just get them started. So get her started on something, but pick something that maybe that you know is beautiful, but maybe that would attract her. You know her tastes. And then get her started, and maybe, once a month, just, 50 pages, once a month, talk about that. And you'll find, you'll be surprised at the things that she talks about. Yes, ma'am.
So I love the list of the teachers, because they're all so special. I just have a suggestion, if you could maybe add some of the teachers that are not here anymore, that are retired, because I was like, what, Miss Hanson, what's her favorite book? Because I want to read whatever she reads, So
yes, I
it just keeps her spirit alive.
Yeah, and I think that list will grow. The list, I believe, we're going to post online, but we can always update it, because I did send that email out 2 days ago, and that's just who could reply to me. So I know there's a lot of teachers and staff that want to add to the list or add more books to the list. And it's funny, just when you talk about books, especially in humanities department or Oakcrest, it's just, we all just start talking about all these books that are our favorites, and the list grows. I remember I was typing Mrs. Lanzalotti's birthday thing with her. I was typing her favorite books, and I said, what's your favorite books? And then she just started growing, and then she had more than me on there. So, yes, thank you for that. I think I will update that list.
You partially answered this question with the other comments, but how do you balance, or how do you encourage when the required reading list is already so extensive and heavy? And
right.
I mean, like, so much time is taking just getting through
and
those. So much annotation and thought that when it comes time to read something for pleasure, yeah, it's going to be an easy read because they just don't want to go through that again.
Right, and you can have easy reads that, I mean, simple doesn't mean it's not a good book. I love The Secret Garden. It's beautiful. I read that when I was in middle school, and I thought it was cool. I liked the story, and there was a movie that's sort of accurate, but it's a beautiful movie too. And then when I read it as an adult, every child should go to a botanical garden because it's just this soul that's in a garden. I didn't see that when I was a child. So just getting, so a simple book, maybe even a book they read as a child and they think, well, it's done. I already read the Chronicles of Narnia. I already read them twice. My nephew and I, that's the only thing we read is that series because he's kind of a reluctant reader. And so it's what he knows, and so we'll just read the Chronicles of Narnia again. So a simple book is fine if she's overloaded, and also 20 pages at a time is fine, right? It doesn't have to be every single day. The every single day reading challenge was mostly for the girl who wants to read the stack of books and watch it grow and not really care if it's adding or taking anything away from her. She just wants to see the stack grow. For that child, I suggest the reading challenge where you read every day. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Hi. So I obviously have more free time, but I found that when I read books, I read too many pages, and then I get mixed up, like what happened when.
Oh, you read too quickly?
Yeah.
Do you ever read aloud to yourself?
No.
What grade are you in?
Fourth.
Fourth grade. I started reading aloud to myself when I was in third or fourth grade. You might want to do that if you're embarrassed to do that. You can do it when you're alone. But do you? Yeah. If there's something that you're not sure of, you always go back and reread. And also a pencil and writing down what your question is doesn't hurt either. Are there any other? All right, so on the table over here, I have lists from all those books I mentioned, as well as a list of the books I mentioned that I referred to in my talk, but not necessarily has a list of books to suggest from. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and again, thanks to everybody that came out here today. And so next month, on February the 17th, our series continues with a presentation by Vicki Bigliano, and she's an AP Art History teacher here and an interior designer. So I don't know what she's going to cook up for us, but it's going to be spectacular, I know. And then, as you're also well aware, parent partnership plays a primary importance in our view of our education. So today's presentation is one of over 40 events that we're offering for parents between January 1st and the end of May. And you may have received this flyer. There's additional flyers over here. And I would just invite you to go ahead and sit down with your calendar and really, be deliberate kind of in planning out our own education because we have to continue learning all of our lives, right? And I think what we offer here is such high quality that you would do that and you would put it on your calendar and you would feel just completely enriched by coming here. So I know when I was a young mom and I had many young children at home, it was very hard for me to get out of the house. But anytime I came to one of these events, I always was so grateful that I had done it. So much easier for me now because I have to walk from there to here to get to these presentations. But I'm sure you'll find the same if you make that effort. So I hope you have a great rest of the day. We do have tea remaining and cookies remaining, and it's a great opportunity to share your books, your favorite books with one another, and what your own daughters have especially loved even reading here. So thank you for coming.